Thanks for coming out on a Wednesday night. I know after work I'm tired, so I'm glad that you're able to be here, and hopefully you'll find this helpful in some way. And if I get my arrows right here to move this thing, okay. So our talk tonight is on human trafficking, looking at it from an international or global perspective as well as here at home. And let's see if I can get the right, there we go. So I don't have any disclosures. I'm not affiliated with any organization except St. Francis. However, I do have a warning. We don't have any small kids in here, which is good, because some of this is a little graphic. Things that I wouldn't want young ears to hear. So if anybody sees any kids come in and I don't notice, which I should, just kind of let them know. Okay, there's the warning I wanted to give y'all. And I slip once in a while into y'all, so just, I grew up down south and that kind of still sticks with me. Anyway, with trafficking, how many of you think of images like this in your mind when you think about human trafficking? Is this kind of the typical thought that you have? Yeah, me too. Used to be. What would you think if you saw these kids on the street? Would the idea of trafficking cross your mind? Yeah. Let me show you a couple other faces. Pardon me?
They were at a truck stop.
Well, true. Setting might make a difference for you. But what if they were your neighbor kids? Maybe not. Just hanging out. Yeah. What about, we don't usually see who's working in the back of our restaurants, but would you think about this situation as a person potentially being trafficked? Yeah. I wouldn't have either. What about this? Young little kids. Would you think about that potential? Because you hear a little bit about that maybe. Yeah. This is what keeps me awake at night, actually. This is really disturbing. I don't like to even have that thought cross my mind, but it is a huge problem, and not just abroad. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Let's first talk about what is human trafficking. And simply put, human trafficking is the illicit trade of human beings. And it uses recruitment, control, and the use of people for their bodies and their labor. There can be force or fraud or coercion involved, so it can include one of those components or all of those components when we're thinking about human trafficking, whether we're talking about sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And we'll talk more about this as time goes on. It's slavery in the 21st century. And if you think back to Roman times, we all know there was lots of slavery. I mean, that was how their economy worked in the Roman times. If we think back into the 16, 17, 1800s, the slave trade, that was an economical thing, right? But there are more slaves today than there have ever been in any time in history, even when you consider those two time periods that are most vivid in our mind. And if you remember Wilbur Wilberforce in the movie and his fight against the slave trade in the UK back in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1800s, I think if he were alive today, he would think, oh my goodness, I got rid of the slave trade out of Africa, maybe India and some of those parts, and now look what we have that's even worse. So something for us to think about. And the other thing is, it's not just an over there problem. That's one thing I want to stress to you tonight is it's here. It is in our city. Believe it or not, you know, our little city of Fort Wayne. I live in LaGrange, but I still think of Fort Wayne as my go-to town for work, for shopping, for that kind of thing. So how big is the problem? You can see here, $150 billion worldwide. And this was last year's number, so it's probably a little more this year. 40.3 million victims worldwide. And when you think about that, 81% of those are trapped in forced labor, whatever type of labor you want to think about. 25% or 10 million of them are children. And we're talking children, we're talking from the age of 1 to the age of under 18. At 18, they become considered an adult. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit more about children. That's just kind of disturbing. 75% of those trafficked are women and girls. Okay, these numbers are pretty good numbers right here. When we move forward and talk about numbers in Indiana or in the U.S., those numbers aren't as firm because this is an industry that is illegal, it's clandestine, and it's hard to get exact numbers. Numbers from the U.S. come from advocacy groups that try to get numbers as they help people. They come from court records, arrest records, things like that. So it's a little easier to get numbers overseas in places where the trade is legal. And we're going to talk about some of those places as we get there. Human trafficking occurs in all 50 states of the U.S. There's not a state that is immune from it. And in 2016, 1 out of 6 runaways in the U.S. were likely involved in the sex trafficking industry. So this here lies an importance of when a kid runs away from home for whatever reason, and they're not kidnapped, they run away, they're immediately at risk. They are picked up and spotted in these bus stations, in these train stations, in the airports, which probably aren't going to happen, but restaurants. I mean, traffickers are really good at picking out these kids. So we've talked about trafficking in general. Let's look at labor trafficking, because this is a type of trafficking that occurs. Those who traffic for labor are known as recruiters, contractors, employers. Those are the words that you hear thrown around. Coercion is used to force these people to work against their will. Coercion can be violence, can be threats, lies, debt bondage, and I want to share with you an example of what that might look like. Say you have, the recruiters for labor trafficking are often from the country where they recruit the people from. They're actually often from the community. They speak the language, they're kind of known. And so they're kind of trusted by the people that live there. But they're connected with somebody or some syndicate or group in another country that's wanting this labor force to come in, okay? And so you have the recruiter in country who goes to a very poor family. And how many of you have traveled abroad? How many of you traveled for leisure abroad? Okay, what about mission work? Okay, so you that have traveled for mission work understand this. When you travel for leisure, you don't see it. The poor, the poorest of the poor in undeveloped countries, they have maybe 1 meal a day. In Nigeria, you would ask someone, did you eat today? Yes, that's 010 or 011, meaning no breakfast, 1 is lunch, 0 is no supper. So they identified how many meals they got for the day. And so they work just to put food on the table, sometimes for 1 meal a day. So they're very vulnerable. So it's just to keep a roof over their head, which, you know, they're going to the river to get water out. Very vulnerable. And these recruiters come to them and say, hey, you've got a teenager or a young person in your home. I can get them a job in the UK, in the US, someplace in Europe, Italy, wherever it is. I can get them a job. I'll help them I'll get their passport for them. I'll help them travel. I'll get them set up. They'll make a good wage. They might get to go to school. And then they can send some money back home to help support the family. And they can pay off their travel as they work. And that sounds like a good deal to some of these parents. And they let their kids go. And if you think of a 15, 16-year-old and it sounds like an adventure, and then they're pressuring the parents, like, I want to go do this, right? So they go and they get to wherever it is they're going to. And what happens? They come in legally because they've got a passport. The passport gets taken and held. They don't speak the language. They can be threatened or disabused physically. And so they're afraid. They don't know what to do, and they can never work off their debt because as they're working, they get very little to live on, and the money that they make, they don't get to keep any of it, and it doesn't get applied to their debt, but yet they get clothes they need, they have to have a place to live, they have food, and the traffickers apply all that, and the fees just build up. So they're in debt bondage. They can never get out of it. And it happens to adults too in these other countries where they maybe need money to buy a cow right? And they end up in debt bondage to somebody in the country. So just to kind of help understand that. And there's a 2014 study that showed 71% of victims entered the U.S. legally. So that kind of puts a new light on it sometimes for us, because we think they're all coming over the border illegally, and it's not true. Oh, one thing I want to show you. Let me go back. I don't know if I can go back. So let me just tell you, you probably saw that settings. So where does labor trafficking happen? And I'll give you a bigger slide on that later, but domestic servants, that's a really great place for them to be. Sometimes you hear of public officials. You've heard that in the news a couple of times, like they had somebody that they brought in that they're almost keeping captive, and it comes out, they're not reporting them on their taxes and things like that. Farm workers, door-to-door sales crews, construction workers, carnivals, and in health and beauty salons. And think about this, I don't know how many of you get your nails done, but largely those are Asian-owned shops, right? So what happens with many of them that come over from China or somewhere in Southeast Asia, and the situation I've talked about, so they know somebody, it might even be a family member relationship, and they come over, and as soon as they get here, the passport's taken, and now they're working 12 or 14 hours a day. In the nail salon, they largely don't speak English, so you can't communicate with them very well. And they can't say, hey, I need out of here. You know, they're keeping me in here 14 hours a day. I get a little cot to sleep on, and I can't function in society because they're afraid. You know, they're threatened by the fact that, oh, if you tell anybody, you could be arrested. You'll be in trouble. Not understanding our laws, and that no, they wouldn't be in trouble. The people that brought them over here and that are using them in these shops. And I'm not saying that's all shops, but I'm saying that is a very likely possibility in these nail salons. Okay, I want to play this video for you. This is about labor trafficking. I just like you to hear the stories.
We like to think of agriculture as good, clean, outside work. Something healthy and wholesome and outdoors, and kids working for their families' farms and helping out when they can. The reality is today, farm work is something completely different.
I started working when I was 11 years old.
It feels like you don't got no choices. You don't feel the same as other kids.
There are hundreds of thousands of children working on U.S. farms. And many kids who are working on large commercial farms. The child labor law in the U.S. is pretty good, except when it comes to agriculture. And then it has a big gaping hole. U.S. law allows children to work in agriculture at far younger ages for unlimited hours outside of school in much more dangerous conditions than any other sector. So a child can work perfectly legally for any farmer at age 12. That child couldn't work serving the food, that he can work 10, 12, 14 hours picking. Farm work is actually the most dangerous occupation that's open to kids in the U.S. in terms of fatalities. Kids are working with dangerous and sharp tools, doing work that may require them to be bent down for hours. I've talked to kids who've worked in 14 states around the U.S., and kids told me about the toll that this work takes on their bodies.
The airplane flew over the field and began spraying on the field, and I didn't know what the spray contained or what it was. The drift was coming towards our field because it was windy, and I'm thinking, oh, it's just water, they're making the crops grow better.
Now, pesticide exposure isn't good for any farm workers, but it's especially bad for children whose bodies are still developing. Farm worker families are typically very, very poor. And kids told me that they worked in order to put food on the table or to fix the family's truck or to pay the phone bill. Kids are working because their families really need the money. When children work so many hours during school and over the summers, it really hurts their education. Kids who migrate leave school early and go back to school late, missing weeks or months of school every year. These kids are from Texas, where school started 3 days ago. Now, some of these kids will enroll in Michigan schools when those start up in a couple of weeks. Others will just wait till they get back down to Texas.
It was hard to catch up in school. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for me because sometimes I'll be there in class and my friends know everything I didn't know. And it was hard, and sometimes I feel like embarrassed because I never catch up with them.
Kids are also working because it's legal. U.S. law presents it as a legitimate choice for families to send their kids out to work, and employers are free to hire them. Do they pay each person?
Yeah, they pay us each person.
Yeah, so even like your 12-year-old daughter is going to make.
They pay her.
by the
Yeah,
hour.
they pay her. Like she's 12, so he probably won't make the check under her name because she doesn't have any ID or anything to cash the check, so that he'll just probably put it in my check.
The Fair Labor Standards Act is U.S. federal law that, among other things, prohibits child labor. But when the law was passed, a big exception was left for agriculture. In 1938, a lot of Americans lived on family farms, and far fewer Americans graduated from high school or needed a high school diploma. Today, the picture is different, but the loophole remains.
It's not right that these kids, and including me, that I lost my childhood, and other children should lose their childhood as well.
When I turned 14, that's when I dropped out from school and went to the strawberries in Florida. And then we came back to Ohio and started working on the pickles, harvesting. But it really hasn't been easy.
Right now, there's a bill pending in Congress called the CARE Act. And it's a bill that would amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to apply the same rules to kids working in agriculture as kids working in any other sector. A lot of people walked beans or detasseled corn or did other kinds of farm work when they were teenagers. But the CARE bill is about protecting the most vulnerable kids. Not kids who are doing chores, but young kids who are working for such long hours and compromising their health and their education.
Okay, I wanted that just to give you a flavor of labor trafficking and how it affects the kids, particularly in our country. I'll start from here. Okay, we're back. Good. So you can see, if you remember, I talked about the use of violence, threats, coercion, debt bondage for labor trafficking. The same types of things are used for sex trafficking, because we're going to move into sex trafficking now. To force adults and children to engage in commercial sex acts against their will. In U.S. federal law says that any minor under the age of 18 engaged in commercial sex is a trafficking victim regardless of force, fraud, or coercion. Those three things don't have to exist if you're under 18. It is still against federal law. And I want to share with you, so you think about what puts people at risk. Runaways, we've talked about a little bit. Homelessness definitely does. Victims of domestic abuse, so physical violence. Sexual assault or sexual abuse in the home, and then war. We don't think of war so much in our country, but when you think about the Syrian refugee crisis, I don't know how many of you have paid attention, you don't hear it much on the news, in American news channels, but Bangladesh has been going through a huge crisis, huge humanitarian crisis with the people right on the border that are forced to live in these camps. And they are, the kids and the women and boys, because we're talking about boys here as well when we're talking about sex trafficking, terrible risk. And I think about that when you hear of natural disasters as well, especially abroad. But you think of the situation that happened in New Orleans with Katrina or Biloxi, or when people are displaced, they become at risk for traffickers. Yes.
By calling it commercial sex, is that strictly having to do with money changing hands, or could it be other things like clothing and food and
it
fall under our laws?
It could. It's really for money, okay. But the money, the food and clothing go along with it. But it is the exchange of money. Yeah. I want you to think also about the fact that girls and boys, but specifically girls here, teenage girls I'm going to mention, are at risk. And I've talked about it happening in Fort Wayne. There was some issues in the Fort Wayne schools. I don't know if they're still going on. This was last year. And the year before that, Dr. Deb McMahon from the health department was working on this issue, along with a friend of mine who works at the state level with a group called IPATH. And that IPATH involves law, the police, and the healthcare field. And they're all trying to work on this problem together. So anyway, this is a situation that occurred. I won't tell you exactly where, but it was a 15-year-old girl. This is one of many examples, okay? 15-year-old girl in the high school has a boyfriend who's 16, 17 years old. And he's pressuring her to have sex with him. She's never had sex before. And she keeps pushing him off. But at some point, you know, he's like, well, I don't know if you love me if you don't have sex with me. And so she gives in. And unbeknownst to her, he has filmed this act on his phone, okay? And she doesn't want her parents to know, of course. She would be devastated. And he comes to her and he says, I have this on video. And I'm going to show your parents, and I'm going to show kids at school if you don't do something for me. And so what does he want her to do? He picks her up. He said, I want you to be ready at midnight after your parents go to bed, and I'll pick you up outside. You meet me at the car. And so when she gets in the car, there's another guy in there, and they take her to a hotel room that they have rented. And they sell her repeatedly that night to men coming in. And they take her back home before sunup, so her parents don't know she's been out. And now she is caught in a web of lies and fear. She doesn't want her parents to know. She doesn't want her friends at school to know. She feels terrible about herself. And what are the parents seeing? And this goes on for like a year, multiple nights a week for a year. And she starts to use drugs, which is very typical because they have to dull the pain emotionally and physically of multiple men, not the most gentle of men either, during a night. And so what are the parents seeing? They're seeing a teenager who's moody, maybe depressed, won't talk to them, maybe the grades are slipping, kind of common teenage things, right? But she's not going to tell them what's happening. But eventually this particular girl did tell her story, and they did, I don't know what happened to the boys, but she did get help, but recovery takes a long time. And so I tell you that story so you can see how that can happen to people that you know. Boyfriends are, and you'll see it on a different slide, boyfriends are known to be very good at trafficking young women. It puts lots of pressure on them. So the point I'm hoping you're hearing is that sex trafficking happens in a lot of ways. You saw the different faces of it that I showed, so it can happen to anyone, but there are definite risk factors that cause this to happen and that make people vulnerable. So here's some statistics about sex trafficking. Globally, 4.5 million people are trapped in the forced sexual exploitation industry. In 2014, so this was 4 years ago, the Urban Institute did some research and they looked at the economy of underground sex. And the lowest amount was in Colorado at almost $40 million a year. And the highest amount was in Atlanta, Georgia at $290 million a year. This is a huge economy. If you think of the people that are making money off this problem isn't going to go away easy because there's people that have vested interest on this, in this continuing. And that was 4 years ago, so the numbers would be greater now. And when they interviewed the pimps during this study, or the traffickers, the pimps reported taking home $5,000 to $32,000 a week, depending on how many girls they have out there, or boys working for them. Largely it's girls, but men are involved in this as well. And they estimate that 76% of transactions for sex with underage girls start on the internet. We're going to talk about that a little bit more too. I want to share, I was in the Netherlands last week for a conference not related to human trafficking, but I wanted to share this with you because it's very pertinent to the topic, and I'm hoping you can help get this word out. So many of you know, how many of you heard of the Women in the Windows, the Redlight District in Amsterdam? Have any of you been there? You've been in the Netherlands, okay. So I purposely did not want to go into the Redlight District because I knew that these women, some of them sit with pillows in front of them because they feel like a piece of meat in a display window, and they are. But the streets are twisty-turny, there's canals running through, and my cousin was with me because my husband couldn't go, and we stumbled into the Redlight District. We were walking and talking, my cousin all says, Beth, I think we're in the Redlight District because there's a woman in the window right there, and I'm like, oh goodness, and I just got so, I was shocked, first of all, because I didn't expect to be there. That was not my plan. You can take canal boat tours specifically through the Redlight District just to look. It's really sad, but anyway, so the story has been over all these years. Of course, it's legal in the Netherlands, at least at this point. It's legal because it's a great career for women. They can make a lot of money. It's something they can do. It's a good economy for the Netherlands. Nobody's hurt by it. We can, if we make it legal, which they did, then we can control the healthcare problems because we can provide screening. And well, A21 is a group that works out of the U.S. to fight human trafficking. They have an office in the Netherlands that's worked very hard to bring out the true story. And how they've done this is interviewing women that are working, the women in the windows, some who have left, some who are still there. Many of them, I think the number is about 36%, have been trafficked in, the ways I've told you, from other countries, thinking they're coming for a modeling job, or they're coming to do some other kind of work to make their life better. And they get there, and the men put them in these windows. And so what I want to share with you about that is most of them take drugs. They have to work 12 to 14 hours a day, standing in this window, and right behind them is a little room. So the guy comes to the window, knocks, opens up, they agree on the deal. She takes them to the room for 30 minutes. It's 50 euros for 30 minutes, and there's a couple acts that are involved in that, and if you want more or something different, you pay more. And so the girls on average make 365 euros a day, which is about, I don't know, $375 to $400 a day. But the girls don't keep that. The trafficker keeps that. The girls keep about 9 euros a day, which is about $12 a day. And that pays for food. So they have no money, really. And most of them have no passport, and some of them don't speak the language. And the sad thing is that some of the Netherlands has taken a different look on this recently. Some legislation went up in February to try to make this illegal. I don't know that it's been acted on yet. I looked today and there's nothing out there that it's been acted on. So A21 has gotten the story out that many of these girls, like as many as 1,500 between the ages of 12 and 20, have been trafficked from the country of Netherlands. They're their own country women being trafficked here. So this has caused a great stir. The stories the women have told has caused great angst and embarrassment for the Netherlands. Women who are in the window talk about the violence that they encounter from the men that buy them. And one lady said specifically that the men from the UK were the roughest and the most violent, and how disrespected they are. Some men will urinate all over them, and just things that are almost unimaginable that happen to these women. And so my brother, when I came back, he's like, did you see the women in the window? I'm like, yes, accidentally I did, and I got out of there as quick as I could because a friend of mine asked me if they looked hopeless, and she works in trafficking. And I said, Chris, I couldn't even look at their face. I just had to get out of there. It felt so uncomfortable, and there's just all kinds of men walking up and down, and women, and 2 Asian women went up to a window with their camera, and they're knocking on the door like this is an animal in a cage. Let me get a picture of you, you know. So anyway, my brother said, oh yeah, those women make good money. And I'm like, Doug, this is the truth. Let me tell you the truth. These women don't make good money. No woman or little girl dreams of growing up and selling her body, much less selling it 20 times a night. And so he didn't know. He did not know. And there's a lot of people that don't know. So maybe you guys can spread that word about the Netherlands. Okay, I want to play 2 more videos for you, and then I won't video, because these are a couple of different stories. I told you one story of how an American teenager got caught up in trafficking. These are 2 more stories, and this is the last time I'll show videos, because I know it's kind of hard going in and out, but I think it's important. I think it's helpful. That's the thing I want to say. Let me try this again. We said we're going to do this.
My name is Brooke Axtell, and I'm a survivor of child sex trafficking and domestic violence. When I was 7 years old, my mom was hospitalized. During that time, I was entrusted to a nanny, and he sexually assaulted me. He forced me into child pornography and sold me to other men for sex. I was subjected to the most sadistic forms of abuse. And during that time, my one desire was for somebody to come and save me. The aftermath of sexual assault and child sex trafficking reverberated throughout my life. I struggled for many years, feeling that it would be better if I didn't exist, that I was completely without value. I wanted to die. There's still a misconception that sex trafficking, and particularly the trafficking of children, only happens in developing nations, that this is not a problem that impacts us in North America. But the truth is, every day children are being trafficked in our cities. Children are being exploited for profit. And we are at a turning point where we desperately need others to awaken, to offer their voices, their gifts, to bring an end to this injustice. When we bring everything into the light, the darkness no longer has power. I now have the tremendous privilege of mentoring women and girls who are survivors of sex trafficking, and I am in awe of their beauty, their creativity, their wisdom, and their courage. Those who overcome violence and trauma of all kinds are alchemists. We transform pain into power, transmute suffering into wisdom. We take the raw materials of what we're given and we become the artists of our own lives. I am so grateful that I have the life that I have now, that I chose to endure, that I chose to embrace my voice and speak my truth when it was most difficult. I am grateful that young women allow me to be a part of their lives and allow me to remind them that there is hope on the other side and that they're worth fighting for.
Katarina Rosenblatt says she was only 13 when her mother, escaping an abusive relation, took her to live in a hotel in Miami Beach. She remembers her mother worked long hours and she wandered alone.
Soon enough, there was a trafficking ring that spotted my vulnerability, being alone, having low self-esteem coming from a dysfunctional home life. You know, they spotted that. And so there was an older girl that recruited me, and she came up to me as a big sister. And so she was 19 and thin and pretty and everything I thought I wanted to be.
Kat says the girl's name was Mary and she had a plan.
She introduced me to her pimp, and I didn't know he was a pimp. I didn't know he was a scam artist at the time. I thought he was just a nice man, like a father.
Soon after, she remembers finding herself inside a hotel room, dressed as a bride, convinced she was playing a game. She remembers the locked door and drugs on the table.
This guy who was half-dressed with a beer belly hanging out, ready to partake in his transaction. He had negotiated the price with Mary. I should say 20 years ago, the price was $550 for a virgin girl.
Kat says that time she managed to talk and plead her way out of this situation. But soon after, she says she was tricked again, this time by a friend's father.
It came in a place that you would never suspect it, and that was in my middle school. I was in 7th grade, and they blindfolded us and took us to a brothel in Broward County from Miami to Broward. They had paid her father $40 for each of us.
She doesn't remember how long she was there for and how many men came by.
And they let me know what would become of me if I ever told anyone. They told me that they knew where I lived, they knew who my teachers were, they knew what school, they knew everything about me. There was nothing I could do to protect myself, and at 14 years old, I didn't even know where to begin.
She dropped out of school and became addicted to drugs. Prostitution didn't seem so foreign anymore. She met up with a pimp. Her dreams were crushed.
I'm nothing but a drug addict and I guess a prostitute for these guys. At 15, I had given up on myself. I belonged to the street. I belonged to whoever would show me kindness or give me cocaine.
More than 20 years ago, a drug overdose and a customer with AIDS scared her so much she ran away from that life and never looked back.
And I just remember waking up and walking away and saying, I'm done with this. I'm never going back there. These people could care less about me. They would kill me if they could.
It was not until recently that she dared to tell her story. Her motivation was to help girls in her same situation. Now, Kat works along law enforcement to help them better understand the industry. She also started an organization that provides shelter, support, and counseling to victims of trafficking. The name, There Is Hope for Me. Adriana Hauser, CNN, Miami.
So there's many stories that you could listen to, and they have different twists to them. But I think the main point is making us aware of what can happen. The top 3 venues, and I've listed them here. This was as of 2017 for labor trafficking, would be domestic work, agriculture, and the traveling sales crews. And then when we look at sex trafficking, the top 3 venues are illicit massage and sex spa businesses, hotel or motel-based businesses, and then online ads through the internet. And I'll mention Backpage in a minute. Let me go ahead and go to this next slide. Where do you find trafficked people? This includes labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and I won't read them all to you. Many of them I've mentioned, but definitely escort services. When you go to Las Vegas, they're advertised everywhere, right? Bars and strip clubs. Not all women in strip clubs are providing sexual business. I don't know how else to say that. But many are, and many are on drugs to get them through that. I've got a friend that does some mission work to some strip clubs in Kokomo. There's 2 that are very prominent there. And they go in and they just come up alongside the girls. Is there anything I can pray for you about? How are your kids? They bring them little gifts. And just meet them where they are. and some have made this conscious decision because of bad life that I'm going to do this because I don't have any value anyway, and I'm going to do this. And others kind of get hooked on the money. I mean, there's various reasons. But again, some sell themselves and some don't, and some have traffickers and some don't. What are the components of trafficking? So you have a recruiter or a spotter. This is the person out on the street who is amazingly talented at spotting these vulnerable people and really talking with them and connecting and making that deep connection and luring them in. It can be a boyfriend, as we've talked about. It can be a neighbor, family members. Family members traffic their own children. And you've got the trafficker and the pimp. We're going to talk more about that. It's the same thing. They control the victim through abuse, through lies, through deceit, and power. And then you've got the victim, which is the trafficked person. And then you have the consumer, the person who buys the sex. And they may not be aware that the person is suffering. And I'm going to show you some interesting facts about that and tell you a couple stories. But the bottom line is that the only way we can stop trafficking is we stop the consumers. There's a couple of states that when they arrest the John, which typically doesn't happen, but in these few states that do, they then put his name in the paper along with what he was arrested for. And that has an impact when their name comes out. I'll share a little bit more about some of that as we go. How are victims recruited? Again, they're groomed by these recruiters that are out on the street. It can be a boyfriend, and I mentioned family, acquaintances. There was a study by Polaris. Polaris is another big group. The two big groups are A21, I'll have it on a final slide, and the Polaris Project, Polaris, who their fight, their total existence is globally and nationally against human trafficking. And they did a study that showed 26% were recruited off their own personal social media account. These traffickers are going specifically to kids' accounts. And that's why if you have kids, if you have grandkids, you have to be so careful. If you think, kids have this on their phone now, and they are so vulnerable and they believe anything. And it can come from a great home and still have that insecurity. And you think of a 13, 14-year-old girl and a guy tells her, oh, you're so beautiful. And then they can tell them lies about their parents. Well, your parents shouldn't tell you that. They shouldn't restrict you in that way. And they lead them down a road. You've got fake employment agencies, word of mouth, and then abduction. Abduction is not the biggest percentage. It's these other ways of recruitment. When we're talking about the trafficker, again, it could be someone the victim knows, like their family member, and families are known to, fathers and stepfathers are the main people in the family, but mothers have been known to traffic their children even when they're toddlers. Some are born into trafficking. Can you imagine a toddler being trafficked? But it happens. And the average age that a trafficker begins in their business of trafficking is 22 years old. They start developing their business. Some start younger at 18. In the US, up to 36% of traffickers of juveniles are family members. They're fathers and their stepfathers of these kids. And I want you to think about this in relation to the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic in heroin, that is, you all know about it in the news, it changes the pathway in the brain. There are chemical changes that happen. The dopamine, that feeling you get when you have a great meal, or we're talking about sex, when you have sex, that high. Well, heroin is literally 100 to 1,000 times more powerful than that. So when a person uses, they're always forever seeking that next high. It controls them. And it can control them to the point of selling their children for sex or for the drug. So you can think you add the opioid epidemic into what is also now a bad situation anyway. And then regarding the traffickers, 30 to 60% of traffickers are boyfriends. So it's a large percentage. And traffickers can work on their own, or they can be part of a larger organized crime unit. The consumer, the buyer, you might know him as the John. It's anyone who knowingly or unknowingly purchases goods or services from a trafficked person. On average, they bought their first sexual encounter at the age of 21 or older, and frequently Johns are known to be married and older. But you know, it kind of feels like, oh, everybody, all men are not bad. Most men do not do this stuff. And let me share this with you. Only 14% of men, which is still a lot, but 14% of men in the US pay for sex in their lifetime, whether that's once or multiple times, I don't know. In the internet chat rooms where men can line up sex, those men happen to be older, they happen to be more highly educated, and they happen to be more wealthy than men who are going out on the street and purchasing women or boys off the corner. There was a Chicago study done, I think it was about 3 years ago, where they interviewed sex buyers or consumers. And 13% of them said that they would rape a woman if they could get away with it. So instead they go buy it. And 19% said they had raped a woman. Now they didn't say whether they had paid and then raped her or they just raped somebody and that was a separate transaction. Half of them knew that the women were controlled by pimps and didn't want to be doing what they were doing. And then buyers in the chat rooms recognize how young these children are, 5, 6 years old sometimes, and it makes no difference to them. So this is a certain segment of the population that has really gotten themselves twisted up. This is the Indiana law. This is the definition of a trafficked person. A person who by force, threat of force, or fraud engages a person in forced labor, involuntary servitude, marriage, forced marriage happens, prostitution, or participation in a sexual act. And in minors under the age of 18 in Indiana, prosecutors do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And any individual can be guilty of committing a crime of trafficking a child, even a family member. It doesn't matter if it's a parent. And I won't read the rest to you. I want to be cognizant of your time. I've got just a few more things. We got a little bit late start here, so if you need to leave, I totally understand, and I'll finish for those that are still able to stay. I want to go through a few myths with you. Myth number 1, all prostitutes are willing participants. They want to do this, right? That's not right. 44% of survivors said they were 17 or younger, and the average age of first participation was 19. I've told you the home lives that many of them come from are the things that put them at risk. Thank you. Every year, 1 million children are exploited, and this is in the U.S., by the commercial sex trade, well, worldwide. Commercial sex is violent and it's dangerous, and the average age is 34 when so you start at 17, the average age of death is 34 because of the violence involved, because of the disease that's involved, and the drugs in this industry. Myth 2, human trafficking occurs only in foreign countries. Well, we've talked about that, and we know it's not true. There's some numbers there, 14 to 17,500 men, women, and children are trafficked in the U.S. every year. And in the U.S., of sex trafficking victims, 83% were U.S. citizens. We mentioned that with labor trafficking. They're not generally here without a visa. They are our citizens, or they're here legally. Myth 3, victims of human trafficking will immediately tell you they're being trafficked and ask for help. No, they won't. They feel horrible about it, they're embarrassed, they're scared, they're threatened. And that's why IPATH that I mentioned here in this state is working with healthcare workers to recognize, they're training them to recognize trafficked people that come in through the ERs, that come in even through urgent cares, maybe a family practice office, because largely the pimp is with them and they're controlling them, they're speaking for them, they don't want to leave the room. So all of us, and I've worked in the ER, I've worked in urgent care, it makes me sad to think, especially in an ER, that I have probably in my lifetime of 23 years of practicing missed 1, 2, 3 victims. I probably have and didn't know it. I was thinking specifically of a lady in an emergency room, and this sounds like a funny story, but now I think about it, it's not. It's St. Anthony's in Michigan City. I was working in the emergency room one night. It's about midnight. She comes in with a vaginal discharge, and I'm doing the pelvic exam. I put the speculum in, and I'm like, what is that? Do you have something up here? And she goes, well, I don't know. And I pull it out, and I said, do you know you have a $5 bill here? Oh, I forgot I put that there. Now, I don't know. Was she being trafficked? Maybe. Sure makes me wonder, and I missed it if she was. I didn't ask the question, because women who come out of trafficking have said in their interviews, if somebody had said something to me, I may, or if they've gotten the pimp away and then examined me on my own, I may have said something. So we have to get better at that. Myth 4, there has to be elements of physical restraint, violence, or abuse in order to say a person's been trafficked, and that's absolutely not true, because there's psychological control that is just as bad. You may not see anything on the outside like those teenage kids I showed you. So I'm going to show you this map. This is as of last year. It's put out by the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, and I told you that the numbers are, we don't know how good they are. It could be a lot higher. It's probably not lower, but maybe a little bit lower. We don't know, because it depends on who's called into the National Human Trafficking Center. It can be people reporting people they're concerned about, or it can be people being trafficked themselves. And if you notice, the red areas on the coast are the hotbeds of trafficking. Look at the Midwest, right here. We're like the number 3 hotbed, right? It's happening here. Don't think it's not. I'm not going to read that to you, but these are the 27 statistics to the hotline nationally. And then these are the ones for Indiana specifically from that National Human Trafficking Hotline. And again, I want to throw this out to you that a very risky time for trafficking to happen in Indiana is at Super Bowl game. When it was here, women are brought in from across state lines to be trafficked to men at these games who are out to have the best time of their life with their buddies. Not all men. I'm not picking on men. You and Mark, not at all. I mean, I show you the statistics. It is not most men. It is this segment of men. So I feel bad because, you know, I don't, okay. I keep looking at you and I'm like, oh, she thinks I'm like, no, not at all. I have a son and a husband, and I love men, so, in a good way. I love men in a good way. Trafficked youth. Let me just share a couple more things with you, if you've got the time. So looking at trafficked youth, 75% of those who enter the trafficking in 2004 were advertised online. So if you magnify that out 14 years, and the use of the internet has increased, the social media, Facebook, Backpage, Craigslist, Backpage especially, they've been in front of Congress recently with how they are advertising under the guise of many things, women and boys and children in the sex trafficking trade. Be aware for your kids. Upon entry into the trafficked life, the commercial sex business, 1 out of 6 were under the age of 10. I'll tell you that most kids that are trafficked by their family are trafficked under the age of 10. It's just terrible. Most felt that their teacher would have been a great opportunity for them to talk to. So I've got the number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline to give to them, or to make the call if you suspect. Kid's not going to bring it up to you. If you're a teacher and you suspect it, see if you can build trust. It takes time. Build trust, make them feel safe, and see if check out the situation and report it if you think something's going on. 17% reported their family member as their trafficker. And then there's the 80% of those trafficked by family members were age 10 or younger. These are the things that make a person vulnerable, all the things that we've already talked about. Why not escape? Well, they may be in danger if they try to leave. They may be, largely they're addicted to drugs. How are they going to get their next drug fix if they leave? The drugs make them a hostage. The traffickers have a strong bond with them called the trauma bond. So it's psychological, it's physiological. I compare it to an abused woman, in an abusive relationship, who leaves and comes back, and leaves and comes back. And it takes about, on average, 7 times for an abused woman to leave and to stay gone. So if it's that hard for an abused woman who may have some resources, some don't. It's a much harder for a kid or some person in the trafficking industry based on things I've told you. They fear for the safety of their families. As you heard one say, they know where to find their families sometimes. They're afraid of being deported or arrested because they don't understand that they're the victim. And then what now? So I mentioned Polaris Project, I mentioned A21. They're having a walk for freedom. The nearest one is in Lafayette, October 20th. There's one in Dayton, Ohio, there's one in Sydney. A21 will help you organize one in your area if you contact them. And you can just Google A21 and it'll come up. Rahab's Rope, if any of you are called to go abroad and work, Rahab's Rope is one of many great organizations. It's based out of India. And what they do is they come up alongside women and girls who are being trafficked and boys, and they build trust, and they talk to them until they're ready to leave. And then they bring them into the home that they provide. And they help them overcome. And this is a Christian organization. And they give them a skill so they can support themselves. And there's many organizations like that, especially in Thailand and in Southeast Asia and some of these places, Nicaragua. And then if you want that phone number, there it is. You can always Google that too and get that if you think you might have any need for it. So I don't know, maybe some of you will share information and make others aware to know what's going on. Some of you may feel called to work in this area. And so that's the purpose of me throwing this idea out to Mark, because I feel like sometimes I tell my patients, I'm a tour director. So I give you options for your health care, and you can choose to do it or not. You know, I don't make you do anything. So I'm kind of your tour director, and here's a problem, and you may or may not be called to work on this problem. There's lots of problems in the world. So anyway, if you have any questions, I'll try to answer it. If not, thank you for coming out, especially after work. I know you're tired. I expected to have like 2 people. So thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.